Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring philosophical dialogue. With me is Pierre Grimes, the author of Philosophical Midwifery, which is an approach to philosophical practice that merges philosophy and psychotherapy. He is also the author of many other books, including Socrates and Jesus, a dialogue made in heaven. And he is the founder of the Noetic Society. Welcome, Pierre.
Thank you.
Once again, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Mine.
Now, you have developed the philosophical dialogue into a psychotherapeutic practice.
That's right.
It's really quite a breakthrough. And as I understand it, your work in philosophical midwifery is based on the Socratic dialogue, but not the Platonic dialogue. Right. So I think it would be useful for our viewers if we begin by defining the difference.
I would add to it, it goes back to Homer as well as Socrates.
Yes.
One of the questions that's often asked students is there a difference between Socrates and Plato? Mm-hmm. Well, is there any evidence in Plato's writing where he describes Socrates in such a way that we can use that as a model to make our judgment about Socrates' dialogues? Well, there is one. In the Symposium, Alcibiades describes Socrates' dialogues in a most amazing way. He starts by saying, his very words ignite and wake up people, and they get in such strange states of mind that they're weeping and crying and exalted, all in a dialogue. And he said, but the kinds of people that he talks to are tanners, people who tan leather, mullers, carpenters. He deals with many tradesmen. Now, wait a minute. Those two features you can't find in Plato's dialogues. The bulk of them, he's talking about the elite of society, those people who take positions that we would call professors or sophists. They have their own vision of reality. And Socrates goes around in Plato's dialogues and dialogues with them to show the foolishness of their positions.
Yes.
Alcibiades does not include that in the description. Either he ignored it, or there's a difference, and that's one of the differences.
Now, this is Plato putting words into the mouth of Alcibiades.
About Socrates.
About Socrates.
Right.
So it suggests that Plato understood that the actual dialogues that Socrates had with people in the marketplace were very different than the dialogues that he was writing about in his work.
That's right.
There may be two different Socrates here.
That's right. We can say that.
The fictional and the real.
That's right. And there are other examples you can point out. Like if Socrates was a mystic and he has a way of apprehending the nature of ultimate reality, with how much detail would we like to see his descriptions of the philosophical or spiritual training? While in Plato's Phaedo, there's one paragraph, 2 sentences, where he says, this is the way you separate the soul from the body. Right, collect it from all parts of the body, bring it up. But that's all. No thought about how long the training might be, whether breath should be established with it, and so on. Better than that, in the Symposium, he has a vision of beauty. And the vision of beauty he calls seeing truth, or the nature of reality.
This is Plato.
Yes. This is Plato's understanding of Socrates' description of his teacher's teaching about the nature of love, diathema. And it concludes with that after that, he should then go on and develop perfect virtue and bring it up so that he can become a friend of men and gods.
Okay.
So there's something in addition to that perfect mystical experience of beauty itself. It's insufficient. That's the subject of the Republic and the Parmenides.
Being a friend of man and God.
Right.
Which is, in the Republic, the focus is on justice.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's a magnificent term.
Yeah.
And because of you, I gained a good insight in it over lunch.
Into the nature of justice. Right. Well, yes, and of course that insight came up in our previous dialogue on war and philosophy,
right,
as well. So you see dialogue as a very important, more than a tool.
It's a way of truth, according to Plato.
Uh-huh.
And that form of dialogue is a special kind of dialogue, since it uses the same questions in a variety of ways. So you have to become acquainted with a mode of reasoning specially developed to talk about this realm of being, as he calls it. Mm-hmm. What's being?
Because you see Plato ultimately as what I've been calling a pure mystic.
Oh, yeah.
Looking at pure being.
Yeah.
What does it mean to be?
See, the experience of divine luminosity, one can ask, what can you say about that experience? Is it possible that some ideas are inherent in that in some way you can then pull them out and talk about that collective that are inherent within it?
Mm-hmm.
Justice, beauty, truth, logos. The very fundamental ideas of philosophy are inherent in that experience.
I think that's true because I hear people talk about it, like Eben Alexander, recently interviewed, who went into a coma and had such an experience. He would suggest, yes, he communed with God. It took, he was in a coma for less than a week, but it was as if he had acquired years and years worth of information in that brief time. Maybe for some people it's a split second.
That's right.
They come out and they have a completely new perspective.
Because that is a totally new perspective, isn't it? To know that in the nature of reality there is some ultimate expression, or the finest expression of the inherent intelligibility of our cosmos and ourselves.
And you can gain that knowledge in 1 second and spend years unpacking it.
Yes. And if you're lucky, you might be able to go back into it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, true. That's why in the Republic of, I think, 134b, he says the goal of philosophy is the knowledge of the self. Now, what's the relationship between that being, or brilliant light of being, and the self? That's the manifestation of the self. Therefore, in the Republic and the Parmenides, the goal is, how can you get a better understanding and come closer to this ideal of the pure self?
And it seems as if probably 99% of philosophers alive today don't think of philosophy that way at all.
Well, yeah, that's true, because they're brought up in schools where no one is exposing them to that. And the other reason is they don't have a group of people like in the Noetic Society that come together for years and talk about that, and have some people who are so proficient in Greek that they can retranslate Plato. Like I'm lucky enough to have people like the Balboas, David Coe, Barbara Steckert, Gina Williana, a whole group of people. And I'm really extremely fortunate and have such a group of people around me, because I couldn't exist and have the kind of thought I have without their cooperation.
And this is a group of people engaged in reinterpreting the classics based on the original meaning of the Greek.
And we argued for a long time whether or not the idea of self is carrying the weight that I think it's carrying. Took a long time, nearly 2 years of study. Then we finally agreed that, wait a minute, everything we know about Plato and Greek philosophy, changes once you see the significance of the idea of self. Because that word is never translated in any modern translation. Mm-hmm. The Balboas have the only translation of it.
Well, it would seem, in a sense, then, that the Platonic school of philosophy is much more akin to ancient Vedanta than we had thought.
Oh, yes. Because as a result of this kind of work, many of our members then go and sit in contemplation centers and Buddhist centers, and I have fun with them sometimes. I say, you're Buddhist sitting on a cushion doing Plato.
Well, as you've explained to me, there's one dialogue in Plato, Parmenides, that really focuses in on the nature of the dialogue itself.
Yes. Let me say one word first. In Plato's Republic, the final teaching for the philosopher king is to master dialectic. Mm. But he only gives one paragraph, just a couple of sentences, and that's all. Mm-hmm. Like Plato does in other dialogues, they're linked to other dialogues. Mm-hmm. Therefore, if you want to study the dialectic, you must go into the Parmenides, for that's where he uncovers it and shows what it means. Mm-hmm. So the Parmenides is remarkable. The whole object is the self. They have a discussion with Zeno. And
the same Zeno of the famous Zeno's paradox.
Right. He comes to Athens, and Socrates and his philosophers are going to visit and talk to Zeno because he's going to publish publicly one of his works that he thought was stolen, and therefore he's going to give it. He was going to hide it. Mm-hmm. So they criticize it, and Parmenides sits back and says, Socrates, the reason you're having a little bit of difficulty answering my questions about what you are saying about Zeno's argument is simply because you don't know the dialectic. And Socrates goes, what? He says, yes. Unless you understand the dialectic, you'll never reach truth. That's a way of reasoning. Your way of reasoning is incomplete. It lacks the depth that you need in order to really become a philosopher. So then the people in the dialogue go, oh, who's going to give an example of dialectic? Zeno says, not me. I haven't heard it for some time. Parmenides. So Parmenides said, all right, I'll do it.
Mm-hmm. It unfolds like a drama.
That's right. It is a drama, you see, because now he has to give an example of his own hypothesis about the nature of reality and show why it must necessarily be true. That's the key.
And as I recall, Plato was at one time had the ambition of being a playwright.
Yes, that's what that said, yes. Mm-hmm. Well, that accounts, by the way, for his brilliant writing. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Parmenides then says, okay, I will give you my own hypothesis. And the way he describes it is, what is the one self, and whether the one is or the one is not. One self. We don't use those two words together.
No, but I do know that my friend Larry Dossey has written a book called One Mind.
All right, then that's one step higher. Yes.
One step higher, one step lower. But that's the idea.
That's where we're going.
Yeah.
See, psychology is moving more and more in the rational direction in discovering mind and the self. Mm-hmm. And many of our contemporaries are coming to this kind of argument. And lo and behold, that's going to change our culture. Right. So what does Parmenides do? He says, look here. To talk about the one self, we first have to talk about the idea of one and then the self. Mm-hmm. So he goes through his question and answer with someone he chooses called Aristoteles, and he takes him through a dialogue, very strict, on how we can understand the pure idea of the one. All negatives. Mm. So then, as it were, he takes all those negatives and says, now you apply that to the idea of the self.
In other words, it's not this, it's not that. You find the same thing, as I recall, in the Upanishads.
That's right. Only the end is different. See, the end, he says, that's the self.
Yeah.
Aristotle, the person who's reasoning with him, says, I don't think it's likely. Now, what does that mean? So he didn't he said, it's not likely. He didn't say, what you're saying about the self is not likely, but your conclusion is not likely. Mm-hmm. Therefore, he must have a different idea of the one. So therefore, Parmenides is going to there. So look here, look here. There are only 4 ideas of the one, apart from the one I just gave you. Mm. We'll take each one, and I'll show you that if you have different ideas of the one, I'll show you what follows from each one of them. Mm-hmm. And after I show you that, I'll show you the negatives, which aren't really negatives, because each one of the so-called hypotheses, or the 4 arguments, the negative argument is to show the necessity for it. That means, what would follow if that idea I just described does not exist, has no meaning? Therefore, there has to be reasoning that would show what are the consequences that would follow that are so terrible that you would have to assume the possibility of your other being true. Mm-hmm. So therefore, he has 4 explorations and 4 negatives, mm-hmm. and then it ends.
He looks at the logical consequences of each alternative and is able to demonstrate that if you follow each of those alternatives to its logical consequence, you end up in an absurdity of some sort. Yeah.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Which leaves the one first interpretation as the only valid one.
That's right. That's what followed. Good mm-hmm. for you. Very good.
Yeah.
Yes. So now the difficulty with reading the Parmenides is that Parmenides starts the discussion by saying to Socrates, dialectic is the only way to truth, but you're going to have a preparation before you get into the study of the dialectic. And what you're going to have to do, you're going to have to follow Zeno's way of reasoning dialectically, because he has very fine arguments in dialectic on a set of ideas. One, by the way, is what follows if likeness exists? Now, the consequences of whether likeness exists, you must show the consequences on these many ideas mm-hmm. we just described, and upon itself, and upon the self. If you don't do that, then you won't understand the idea of likeness. You say after you do that, take the idea of the one and many. Mm-hmm. Now, look here, it's not enough to talk about the one and many. You must show how all the ways you can understand both of those terms, both in themselves and together, will bring you to an understanding of the idea of self. Mm. If you don't do that, you're not going to understand one and many.
In other words, they're looking at things that are so fundamental we take for granted. Everybody knows the difference between one and many, and they're saying, no, we have to take a fresh look at what does this really, really mean.
Likeness. How many people can you stop along the road and say, excuse me, sir, would you mind giving me an understanding of the idea of likeness? I'd like to know how it relates to all of these ideas and how the implications of them together account for the idea
They'll
of the one.
punch you in the nose.
And then tell me how it relates to the self. Uh-huh. They're likely to sit down. Uh-oh. But see, then he says you have to do the same thing for ideas like rest, motion, generation, dissolution. All of these ideas you have to treat in the same mm-hmm. way.
Yeah.
And if you don't do that, you're not going to be able to understand the dialectic that I am using, since those are the terms he's going to use in his own dialectic.
This conversation, we're looking at, in effect, the birth of Western culture.
Oh, yes. High culture it is. Mm-hmm. And the goal, again and again, is stated throughout the dialogue. The goal of this, knowledge of the self, knowledge of the self. Because from the self all things emerge, all things abide, and all things return to. Therefore, Cosmologically, it plays the role of Zeus or a god, the creator.
And I gather that what you've just enunciated is the essence of Plato's thought, and I think the essence of Pythagorean thought as well.
Oh, he even credits Pythagoras throughout this. Yeah. Absolutely right.
But now how about the other Greek philosophers of that era? Would you say it's an Aristotle?
No. See, he took a different tack. Most of Aristotle's argue against Plato, really.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a worthwhile discussion, by the way. But, you see, where can we find examples of such exercises? They're not in the dialogue. We're stuck. If those are the key ideas, likeness, one, many, right, rest, motion, dissolution, and generation, if you need to know those things before you can get into his dialogue, where are examples of it?
Yeah.
They're nowhere in Greek literature until you get to Proclus, 470, 1,000 years later. And in his magnificent work, he has a commentary on Plato's Parmenides. And
from the benefit of looking back at 1,000 years of Platonic thought, much of which is now lost to us.
Yes. And he gives examples of each of these. So now we can say, oh my gosh, now I can understand each of these ideas.
If I recall correctly, Proclus was the last head of the Platonic Academy, founded 1,000 years earlier.
Then Damascus, and that's true. And they saw the end. They were aware that their own age was dying. They saw Christianity coming in and demolishing everything that was of Greek significance or philosophical significance. In Rome, after 70 A.D., they even put philosophers to death because they saw them as public pests. So that they saw their age coming to an end. They saw a dark age emerging.
Well, philosophers have had a way of irritating the ruling class in China as well. They put the philosophers to death.
That's right. Right. Yeah.
I mean, philosophy, it seems, is inherently subversive.
I think so. Because any culture has its own values and goals. Philosophy comes along and says, excuse me, don't pay too much attention to those goals. Turn to the self, figure out why you're here. The goal of Platonic philosophy is just to know thyself. Anything else is secondary. What are you doing working more than you should? What are you gaining wealth that you never will be able to take with you when you drop dead? What are you going to do with your yachts when you're too old to get in them? What are you going to do with all your possessions? Knock them off, study the self, wake up. That's the goal of philosophy. What's interesting, by the way, in the Republic, when he talks about who should become philosophers, who should we select? He says, the best people are the people who have already had their families. They're finished with their social setting, their employment, as it were. We'd call them retired. He says, that's when you can begin.
Those are the sannyasis in the Hindu
That's right. The
tradition.
sannyasin, that's the image of the sannyasin in India. That when your family is set and you finished it, they even build huts in their back of their property sometimes to get the father or the grandfather. He's in there from that point on. Very similar. Their parallels are quite clear, but they don't have a logos. The logos as exhibited in the dialectic.
Right. Well, they didn't speak Greek, but they did have the Atman.
They didn't have, See, Buddhism too. When I studied Tibetan Buddhism with Lama Tata back in the 50s, he could point out the use of the idea of the self. They were there. It played and Korean Buddhism plays a major role. And
it plays a major role in what?
The idea of self. That's a key point. But they don't bring it together through a dialectic so you can understand it on all of the levels in which it's possible to understand it, so you have a complete understanding. Why is there a need for a complete understanding? For Plato, that prepares the mind for insight. When you can settle with what you know, you kick back, put it aside, wait. the chances are very good you're creating the very conditions for intuition or enlightenment. So he would say, the moment you retire, good. Get out your work. Let's go to work.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the Republic, of course, he talks about an ideal state for the soul, not a political state.
Yeah, we've discussed that in a
Yes.
previous
Yes,
conversation
true.
we had about the Republic.
Right.
The idea that it is an exercise in political philosophy, you think, is a misunderstanding, a fundamental misunderstanding of the Republic.
Without a doubt. It ignores what Socrates says in the Republic.
Well, we're going to have a future conversation about the philosopher king and what that means. If the Republic is not an exercise in political philosophy, why then a philosopher king?
Good.
We'll talk about that in the future.
My pleasure. It would be my pleasure.
But one of the points that you've made, and I think it's in the Parmenides as well, is that you can't really understand the Republic until you understand the process of the dialogue.
That's right. The function of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like in each dialogue, he raises issues which other dialogues use as a platform for further exploration.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Ion, one of the great little small dialogues, is what is a philosopher after all? What power does he have? The Republic takes that idea of power and the philosopher and then explores it in terms of what does it really mean to be a philosopher, to have that power, and what can you do with it, and what kinds of changes can you expect from it?
Mm-hmm.
See, that's what he does.
Yeah.
So you have to knit them together, click.
Mm-hmm.
And that's reading Plato.
Well, let me ask you this question. Let's suppose now we're having a dialogue.
Yes.
Philosophical dialogue, the purpose of which is to help to reveal the true nature of the self.
Right.
To us. Well, how do we even begin to do such a thing?
By the way, do you have a self?
Do I have a self?
Yeah.
Well, I would say I am a self.
Oh, is it different from other people's selves?
Yes. At least superficially it is.
Well, how do you account for that superficiality? Is there something that disguises the self from itself?
I would say that it's like, I would give you a metaphor, that the self, the separateness of the self is like islands in the ocean. They seem distinct and separate from each other, but if you go under the water, down to the surface, down to the bottom of the ocean, you'll see all the islands are connected. They're part of the same earth.
Very much like Carl Jung talks about, archetypes. Yes.
Now that incidentally is a metaphor from William James.
Okay, it's also in Papa Jung. Yeah, good. That's certainly a very nice view of it, and that's the way you can see it function.
Yeah.
But did you account for the differences and why the existence necessarily exists?
Well, I would say that the reason there are so many selves that seem so different from each other on the surface is so that the one self is able to have the experience of all possibilities.
I agree with you, but that didn't answer the question to account for the differences. You're saying that once the differences do exist and we can identify them, they can be all experienced by the one self.
Yeah.
But that didn't explain why there are differences, did it?
I would say it's the one self has a creative function that all this comes into being, everything, through the one self, the one mind, the one consciousness, and that one consciousness is also very exuberant and very loving and very curious and wants to know itself in all of its multifold possibilities, and we are here to help that process along.
Say, do you think the self is dumb?
No.
Watch.
All right.
With all of that wisdom and knowledge, then why isn't it apparent to all that have selves? Why is it that myself is ignorant of that self which is the higher? And if there is that higher, is there any way in which I can move from my particular difference to it, you would say?
I would say that to answer that question, I would look towards a game that all children play everywhere in the world. It is a game called hide and seek.
Okay.
And that is a game that we play with our deep self.
See, that's the idea of Leela and Indian literature, Sanskrit, right? Leela.
Yes. The game of enlightenment.
Yes, you see, the difficulty with that is that the cost of our differences is ruinous to us in our society and may bring about the death of our own planet. To turn around and say that is merely play, it's a very dangerous game. It shouldn't be called play, because our own extinction is possible by people with their different selves creating worlds which are hostile to one another. Yeah. How do you account for the differences then? You see, it goes back to that question.
Well, now I suppose I would bring up Stanislav Grof.
Good.
And his work. It's embodied in his book, The Cosmic Game, in which he suggests, yes, it seems terrible. I mean, what would happen if our whole planet destroys itself, if all life, human life, is extinguished on Earth? But from the point of view of the cosmos, it does happen. Billions of planets are probably destroyed every day, for all I know, across the cosmos.
Sure.
And we have to appreciate that the self is deeper than our life history, than our historical self, than our personal dramas, that there is a quality of the self that even survives death, as we know now from the research in reincarnation.
With everything you said, I can still ask, why is it the self can be fooled about the self? That's all.
How is it that we have a capacity for self-delusion?
That's right.
Yeah. And certainly a vast capacity. The human capacity for self-delusion is almost infinite.
Right. And powerful it is. Wars and all that chaos in our world comes from it.
Yeah.
So how do you account for the differences then?
Well, if we didn't have that capacity, maybe we wouldn't be challenged sufficiently.
You see, that would be a consequence of understanding that there are these differences, but we haven't nailed down why there are differences. Well, and that's still left as a question, which I have to return to in this dialogue.
Well, how would you answer that question?
No, I wouldn't care to answer it yet if this is a dialogue. See, the difference between a dialogue and philosophy, Platonic, is that we must continually explore the person we are talking with to see whether they can come to it, or whether at some point they can see that what they're operating on is something inadequate, then they will continue the quest on their own.
Yeah.
Right? So in a true and in Socratic sense, I would say, I noticed that you avoided my question several times. How do you account for that?
Yeah, and I suppose I would say I didn't think I was avoiding your question. I thought each time I gave you an answer and you weren't satisfied.
No. Is that because I didn't understand the answers, or did the answers not answer the question?
Yeah.
Differences. Which would you say?
I would say you're just being stubborn, you old man.
But I would say, yes, you're quite right. I am stubborn. I hold on to the question, and nothing will get me to leave it go. I'm a bulldog with my bone.
Yeah.
So, see, it raises the question, which I love to ask, by the way, many times. Which I encounter very often.
Yeah.
How do you know when a question has been answered such that there is nothing left to explore? That's what I mean. Certainly, people can answer any question with anything they say can be said to be an answer.
Yes.
But is it possible to answer a question such that there is nothing left over to wonder about so that it no longer exists?
Temporarily, maybe.
No, finally.
No, I don't think that's possible.
I do.
Okay.
All right.
You think there are final answers?
No. There are final answers to this kind of query.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That our dialogue will depend upon whether or not you will be able to see that your avoidance of this question is because you haven't really answered the question of how do you know when you've answered adequately a question.
Uh-huh.
That's the issue now.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And I would say there's always something left over that hasn't been answered.
Right.
Ideally, the question itself.
Mm-hmm.
So that I'm left with the same question, which is, since we agree there are differences as we see with the different people's ideas of the self, must we not come to some understanding of how that could possibly be, considering the dire consequences of having a false idea of the self?
Yeah.
Now, to explore that question, a person can have their own belief about the self, which you have. Would you then put that aside or still hold on to your ideas while we are exploring the value of using this exploration?
I'm willing to put all my preconceptions to the side.
Yeah, okay. See, the game of dialogue is that a person really will still cling to those in one way or the other, which will diminish the impact of a kind of a dialogue where the final result is the dropping away of the question.
Well, sure, because if all I'm doing is reaffirming the opinions I already have,
right, what
have I gained?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But are they inadequate, would you say? Still?
Are my opinions inadequate?
No. The ones we were talking about. Have you answered the question, how do you account for the existence of differences in the view of the self? Now, we can go over your answers.
Yeah, okay. We'd have to do that because...
But see, that would be a dialogue.
Yeah. No, yes, I answered that, as I recall now, the universe wants to experience all possibilities.
See, that shows it lacks something that it needs, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Oh, that's a very weak self-ID, really.
Well, you've got a good point.
To be in such a need requires an inadequacy, and that isn't really a very profound idea of the self.
All right.
That's the way we're going.
I see. No, that's a convincing argument. I have to say, I guess that's a poor answer.
Right. Mm-hmm. And this is the way it would proceed.
Yeah.
And then we can say, now that been has put aside, can you return to it and say, by the way, have you ever encountered a self that appeared to be so different from yourself that it caused you to wonder about the self? Now, I went from a general to a kind of example from the differences that would be most marked.
Yeah.
So I would return it that way.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Have you ever had that experience?
Yes, sure.
Yeah. Did it then bring you to wonder about how that person gained that idea, which is so different? Is it worthwhile stopping and saying to the person, sir, there's nothing more important for you to discover than why you're holding such a peculiar idea, which in principle is false?
Mm.
And then you would have to say, well, Harry, I remember Harry. He's so different than myself.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's take that. At the moment you saw that difference, what effect did it have on you? That's a recollection now. Yeah. I remember meeting someone who was so different from myself that I wonder, how could he ever come to be into existence? What is it about? Say, a mystery. He becomes a mystery now. Mm-hmm. What would you do with it?
What would I do with
that?
With that encounter?
Yes.
I've encountered a person who's so different, and I'm puzzled. Well, I might walk away from that person and want to have nothing more to do with them.
No. You want to stay.
I want to. Well, then I'd probably begin to question that person.
Yes.
Yeah.
To discover
how it is they became so different.
Is there some set of questions you might use that you were familiar with, or would you shop around for a new set, or work on impulse, or?
Well, you know me, I don't work from notes.
See, the way this would then go would be to introduce the idea that there is a way of discovering differences and how they came into existence. That's philosophical midwifery.
Yeah.
So then it would turn into that kind of an inquiry. Like, now we could either talk about that gentleman or yourself. Like, when you read that and that work, and it made so much sense to you, I presume, since you're able to recall it and reflect on it with ease, right? What was that moment like? When you first saw it, when you first read it? Leela. It's principally the Leela, is it not? Yeah, two views. Yeah. One view, Leela, infinite play.
You're talking about Stan Grof's book, The Cosmic Game.
Yes.
Yes. When I read that book, how did it impact me? Well, you know, it's really strange now that you mention it, because if you read his book, The Cosmic Game, you get this sense we get so caught up in our world of duality. There's good and evil, and it's so important to take a stand, as we've described, against the injustices of this world and to fight for justice. But from the perspective of the cosmic game, you're stepping outside, you're light years away from that problem. You realize that there are wars and planets and births and deaths and illness and suffering and oppression, and it's all part of a larger cosmic process leading to something so great that the human mind can just barely conceive of it. But when they do, it's awesome, it's beautiful.
Did he, by the way, go through a process of reasoning to show that that conclusion would be necessary?
Well, I suppose he did, yes. It's been many years since I've read the book, but yes, he goes through it step by step. He leads the reader into a very different worldview than the one they typically start out with.
Then he must have then unfolded how certain civilizations or ages are driven to their own suicidal urge. Did he then talk about whether or not any one of them could have survived, or are they all in principle death wishers?
Well, I don't think he probably followed that line of reasoning at all, as I recall, but it's been many years since I've read the book. I don't think I'm prepared to.
Okay, but that's where this would go.
No, this is fascinating because what you're suggesting here is, I often think, Pierre, that, let's say, people who view these videos were a tiny percentage of the whole population. That in my lifetime studying mysticism, studying parapsychology, in general, I found maybe 1-2% of the population even have an interest in these topics that are of such importance to me. And what I'm hearing you say in these dialogues is that this is a methodology available to everyone. Socrates was talking to people in the marketplace. Now, he may not have taken them quite this far, but it suggests that there isn't a human being who can't benefit from the application of a simple dialogue.
Correct. Absolutely.
It's
correct.
Like taking a kind of very elitist knowledge and making it widely available through the simple thing that every person engages in, which is conversation.
I don't find anything to object. That's true. That's why I think these ideas, philosophical midwifery, dream work, should be in high school.
Yeah.
It's capable of changing the everyday man's view. Because, see, we go back to the question, what's the difference between people having different views? But the essential question would be, is there some way they can get a better view of themselves? Is it possible there's an order of different views of themselves so that they can climb into more profound uses of the self until they finally get a final vision of the self itself by itself?
Yeah.
That should be everyday education.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to, it doesn't need college. You need high school. You don't need college. That's for technical learnings. Or people who want to go on in a profession. That's not leading meaningful life. The meaningful life is to, in everything you do. See, one of the goals in this game of philosophy, if you want to see yourself, is you go for broke.
Mm-hmm.
See, in World War II, I was next to a Japanese unit, magnificent unit, 442nd Regimental Team. They were all Japanese students into the military. Colossal, magnificent fighters. They had one slogan, go for broke.
Oh.
Like gambling, go for broke, put all your money on the table.
Mm-hmm.
That's what people should do. They should go for broke. Put everything on the table. Go for, do nothing else. Figure out the self while you're eating and sleeping, do that. But don't get off the question of what, after all, is the self.
Mm-hmm.
What is it that sees and hears right now?
Because you can have dialogue that never addresses that question.
Oh. That's true. Not mine.
I'm thinking, for example, of the Talmud, the Hebrew Talmud,
the
Jewish Talmud. It's all, to my knowledge, dialogue. Rabbis, they're talking about theological issues, but also everything practical about life in general. How do you apply the laws of the Torah to everyday life? But I don't think they talk about the self.
Nope.
Except perhaps some of the Kabbalistic mystics.
That's where you can find it.
Yeah. But for the most part, people dialogue all the time without addressing the fundamental question of who am I?
And is it possible that I have a view of the self that's blocking me from seeing the self?
Yeah.
That's it.
Very important question. Yeah. Well, Pierre, we've covered a lot of ground here once again.
Right.
This has been a magnificent conversation.
I appreciate it.
Pierre, thank you so much.
Right.
I love our interactions.
Right. Good.
And thank you as well for being with us.
Indeed. Indeed.